Good morning, everyone. I'm Tom Christie. I'm here with Shawn Merwin and David and John, and we're going to talk to Shawn about stuff he's got going, what projects he's working on, websites he's got, and then we'll talk about starter adventures after that. So, without further ado, Shawn, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background?
All right. Well, I'm Shawn Merwin. I've been freelancing in the RPG industry for about 20 years. For the last 5 years, I've been full time. Uh, First full time freelancing, and then for the last 2 years and 17 days, I have been the lead designer at Ghostfire Gaming, a RPG company working mostly on D&D compatible products. And for those 20 years, I started out as an administrator in the Adventurers League. Before it was called the Adventurers League, it was just the RPGA. And so for third edition, I worked on Living Greyhawk, Zendrick Expeditions, a couple other campaigns, writing and being the administrator. For fourth edition, I was one of the administrators of the Living Forgotten Realms campaign. And then I did a lot of writing for Adventurers League when fifth edition hit. So I've also worked on Wizards of the Coast products like Acquisitions Incorporated for fifth edition. I wrote a couple chapters of Descent into Avernus. For fourth edition, I co-wrote with Mr. Matt Cernet the Halls of Undermountain hardcover book. And then I've worked on several convention type things, digital offerings from Wizards, and so on. Other game systems I've edited or written for Fate, for Star Trek Adventures, the 2D20 system. I worked on the Knights Black Agents Kickstarter Dracula dossier. Did editing in a few other game systems over the years. So if you go to rpggeek.com and look at the list of things I've done, I've forgotten half the stuff that I've worked on. So I've been doing it for a while now, and someday I'm going to get it right, by gosh.
So you have a really fun. Well, it started as a podcast, but now you're doing YouTube videos for it called Mastering Dungeons. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so Mastering Dungeons is a podcast stream sort of thing that I do with my good friend Teos Abadia. And I started back when it was on the Misdirected Mark network. It was called Down with D&D. When Teos came on, we decided to rebrand a little bit, get rid of the D&D, thing, and make it a little bit more generic. Although we mostly talk about Dungeons and Dragons, and we do a news segment at the beginning where we cover the news of the industry and of RPGs in general. And then we do sort of an analysis segment where we look at game design a little more closely. And when we put that to YouTube, we split it up. So if you only want the news, you can just watch that. If you only want the game analysis, you can just watch that. And we have a Patreon for it at patreon.com/masteringdnd.
Here's a picture of the Patreon.
There you go.
There it is. So I like how every thumbnail is basically a picture of Teos being animated or laughing or gesturing. Is that on
Yeah.
purpose?
And me with my mouth open.
Yeah.
Teos controls that, so he probably tries to
Okay.
catch me in the worst possible facial expression for that episode, and capture that.
Yeah.
I also do a podcast that's sponsored by Ghostfire Gaming called the Eldritch Lorecast,
Okay.
which we do every week. We stream on Monday nights, Tuesday morning Australia time, because Ghostfire is an Australian company, and that's with Ben Byrne, James Hake, and Dale Kingsmill. Ben and James also work for Ghostfire Gaming like I do.
That's cool. I'll have to check that out. And I checked
Mhm.
out a Mastering D&D show just recently. You had a good question on the dying condition and changes
Mhm.
that could be done to that and what would work with it, what wouldn't work with that. So I encourage anyone, check out their Mastering Dungeons or Mastering Dungeons uh,
Mhm.
YouTube channel. And then
Yep.
tell us a little bit about Ghostfire. So what are you working on at Ghostfire?
Ghostfire, I started 2 years ago. They're an Australian company, and they started by being a company that helped gaming companies fulfill things that weren't games, specifically, the text. So they would make maps, they would make minis, they would do these sorts of things. And they got to the point where they thought, we're working with all these game companies. We're gamers. Why don't we start to make the games that we can then use our other expertise to fulfill like Kickstarters for? And so they started hiring people. They did their own Kickstarter first. The world that they created was called Grim Hollow. Is called Grim Hollow. So they did a Grim Hollow campaign guide, and it did very, very well for a bunch of gamers who were not known in the industry.
Mhm.
And so they started picking and choosing people that they wanted to work with, and a little while into the process, they approached not me, but someone else. And the other person said, well, I can't do it because I'm working with someone else, but you should check Shawn Merwin. I was full-time freelancing then. So they came to me and they said, they first said, hey, we're a game company. Would you like to work for us full time? And I thought, nah, I'm happy with doing my freelance stuff. It's not a 9-to-5 job. I can do it when I want. And they're like, well, at least talk to us. So I went and talked to them. And after I heard their plan and their credentials, I was like, okay, I'm in. Let's do this. So we followed up the campaign guide with a player's guide and then a monster grimoire, so a monster manual. And each of those were in the $1 million Kickstarter range, so things were going well. And Grim Hollow is sort of a grim, dark horror fantasy setting, so it's very much in the D&D realm, but it's got a little bit more grit to it and a little bit more horror tinged adventure. So you get things like transformations, which are sort of half curses, half things that your character can do. So rather than just being a werewolf or a lycanthrope, the rules, if you get bit, you have this transformation where you start at the lowest tier, you get some drawbacks but some benefits, and then it goes up as you go, and the drawbacks get worse as the transformation progresses, but so do the powers that you get from it. And people really dug that, rather than just having it be, well, you're a vampire now, so here's your vampire stat block. It sort of melded your character with the curse, with the transformation. So it's that sort of thing where we take the 5e rules, but we put a different spin on them to try to hit that sweet spot for this sort of dark, grim fairy tale fantasy that we're going for.
That sounds really cool. And then you also
Yeah.
have Aurora. That's just
Yep.
getting ready to
Aurora.
start.
Yeah, Aurora kickstarted a while back. We're finishing up production on that. It'll be going to the printer very soon if it's not there already. And this was a world that I've been envisioning for years. It is what I like to call it is not a post-apocalyptic setting, but an apocalyptic setting. So it's not after everything's calmed down and now you need to rebuild. It's things are still turbulent. How are you going to survive? So it's ruled by dragons. At first, this world was ruled by dragons, and the dragons were all not necessarily good, but at least benevolent. At least they were helping keep society in order. And then they were hit by a disease that started to drive all of the dragons, both the true dragons and the dragon kin, so the dragonborn and kobolds and stuff, started to drive them mad. So this society that has been built around dragons is collapsing, or has collapsed, depending on where you set your campaign. And you need to deal with the aftermath of that, which starts with, how do we survive where the dragons were always the one that told us what to do, brought us the food, made sure society worked well. Now that's collapsed. How do we A, survive, and then B, rebuild society to survive in these lands that the dragons ruled? So that's the pitch behind it. You can probably still get it via the backer kit or some other way, but then it will be available on the website. Ghostfire also does, thanks to James Hake and Joe Rosso, something called Fables, which is a subscription service, sort of like a dungeon magazine would be, where each month you get a new part of an adventure. And right now there's 6 adventures in a Fable, and you get everything you need, whether digitally or we're starting to also put them out. Once they're done, we'll put them out in hardcover, and it gives you everything you need to run each adventure in the Fable is supposed to be about 4 hours worth of play 4 times. So if you play once a week for 4 hours, you'd have a full adventure for 6 months. And each Fable so far has been different. The first one was a horror-based adventure in Grim Hollow. The second one was this ethereal expanse adventure. So it was sort of pirates on the ethereal sea. The third one, which has just started now, is called Agents of the Empire, and it's set in the same ethereal realm, but it's more of a James Bond or Jason Bourne meets D&D sort of feel. So you're secret agents trying to stop this world's spanning evil organization from doing horrible world spanning evil organization things.
Wow, that sounds really neat.
Yeah.
John, do you have any questions?
Yeah, I need to find out how I can just buy. Is there like a humble bundle where I can just buy all this stuff?
Everything you've made.
I'm pretty sure I need it all.
There isn't yet. Right now, everything that I've talked about is sort of available at the Ghostfire Gaming website. So you can buy all of the Grim Hollow stuff I've talked about. We did a crowdfunding through BackerKit to actually print the first Fable once it has released. So it has all of the adventures that have been, like, we went back through them, re-edited them, made tweaks based on play that we heard about. But it also has maps and the different doodads you might use at the table. And we did that through BackerKit just to, we wanted to try a different avenue rather than Kickstarter. So we went through BackerKit, and it worked very well. It wasn't the $1 million thing that other stuff is, but we didn't expect it to be. We just wanted it to a way to get it to people a little more easily than going through a full-blown Kickstarter. And it worked really well for what we were doing. So you can still go to BackerKit and look at the Fable is called Citadel of the Unseen Sun, directed by James Hake, but written by a bunch of great freelancers, and you can just order that there.
And this is that all of this stuff, just to be clear, is 5e compatible.
Oh,
stuff.
Yes,
yeah,
absolutely.
Okay,
Yep. Everything that we've worked on up to this point is 5e compatible for sure.
Because I'm interested because I know you dabble in other games, and it sounds like, especially as you're talking about the vampire stuff and those the powers and the way you get some benefits and some disadvantages and stuff like that. That sounds like so many other systems that have that kind of you get a plus, you get a minus kind of mechanic. The D&D doesn't quite do the same way. Are you bringing in lots of ideas from other systems to try and beef up sort of mechanics and to reflect the things you're trying to do?
I won't say we've brought in things from other systems, although obviously if you play other systems, those things inform your design.
It's an homage.
But it's more taking the base 5e fantasy rules and just trying to figure out the best way possible to add something to the campaign without adding a lot to the complexity. So we have something called advanced backgrounds, because backgrounds, were a cool part of 5th edition. They did a cool thing. But one thing that the designers wanted to do was give you ways to have that background still play a part in your life moving forward. So we have these advanced backgrounds that as you level, you also get some special traits or abilities or connections or stuff from that background. As you become a more powerful street urchin, right, people will still remember you as that street urchin made good. So if your street urchin background would give you a network of information, now you have not just that network of information, but you have actual power because of that background that you can do a lot more with. So it sort of advances your character's backstory forward, if you choose to use it as you level your character.
Damn, that sounds awesome. I mean, sorry. Yeah, it's really like work. Yes.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it reminds me a little bit of. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I forgot what I was going to say already.
I was just going to say it reminds me a little bit of the way careers worked in the original Warhammer fantasy role play. You could you start out as a rat catcher and then you get promoted to a other kind of catcher or something like that. Just like weird, horrible things. But yeah, that sounds great.
Yeah,
David?
Shawn, I know you worked on the what was it, the Grim Hollow Monstrous Grimoire? Yeah. I'm wondering, when you were working on that, a lot of monster books have sort of an opinion. So we've got MCDM working on a monster book with that action-oriented design slant, and Level Up had a monster book that kind of worked to fix the math and some of the friction points. Was there an opinion or a design philosophy that you brought to the Monstrous Grimoire?
There was. I mean, that's a really, really good question. So when we started making this book, this was the first book that I started out as the lead. And so from the beginning, we had to decide what's that opinion going to be. So I talked about it with designers. I talked about it with internal staff. And we thought about a lot of different directions we could go, fixing the math, making new systems. And what we came to a consensus on was that the math of D&D specifically is probably unfixable, in the sense that every character, every DM, every campaign is different. And to try to fix math in any direction might just be breaking it in a different direction. And let's let the DMs, the game masters, do what they do, which is figure out exactly how strong their players are, how strong their characters are, and do their thing. So we didn't go out of our way to do anything drastic in terms of the rules. What we decided to do was, how could we tell better stories through our monsters? How could our DMs get into some things that maybe the games might be lacking? And what we did was we created systems for what did we call it exactly? It was it's like you kill the monster. It's not just the monster has 3 gold and a +1 dagger. It's this monster, its blood can be used in this way. This other monster cannot be killed unless it is first hit with something of this creature's blood. So we turned it into this idea of not only are monsters XP that you're going to kill and move on to the next thing, but each of these monsters has a story, and each of these monsters has an intrinsic value. So we focused heavily on lore and on this sort of system of salvage, of getting the most out of each of these monsters. So every monster will have something that is valuable for it. And then we put in a system of, okay, if you want to make your armor out of the shell of this tortoise monster, these are the steps you need to go through. So you might need to get something else in order to do that. And that sort of adds a bit of flavor to the magic items. And it gives players the agency to create their own magic items, rather than either just be given what the DM gives them, or have to have that away from the table conversation about, yeah, my character really needs a +1 set of chainmail, DM, so please give me that. This lets the DM put something in front of the players. The players can then, in character, decide what they want to do and how they want to do it. And it also sets up some interesting decision making that a DM can put in front of a player by saying, well, you have all the tools you need here to go after this threat, but it's going to take you maybe a month or a week or however long to craft the things you need. Are you willing to use that time to do that, with the understanding that this threat may get closer or may get further away or may disappear. And so it adds that element to the game, which I know a lot of people enjoy, but the game doesn't necessarily support it with any set of rules. So that's what we tried to do with the grimoire.
Yeah, I love how that gives the creatures sort of a legendary feel, like these are unique and special entities, not something housed in a room in a dungeon that you kill after 3 rounds of battle and then move on to the next room.
Yep. So that's what we were looking for when we were creating it. And creating a monster book is a whole different animal than creating any other kind of content, because with a lot of text, you have a wall of text and you may have a piece of art, and it's not super easy, but it's not impossible to say, okay, the art goes here, we'll wrap the text around it. With monsters, you have art, you have stat blocks, you have little bits that need to be there, and you have to massage everything to get it just the right way. And so, over 400, a book of over 400 monsters was a beast to christen me into my full-time game design life. But it was fun
that
to
sounds
do.
like a jump in the deep end with all the crunch in a monster book, all the art in a monster book.
Yeah. And then we of course do all the minis and all the maps and all that stuff to go along with it for a Kickstarter. So we it took a lot of coordination, but we have an absolutely amazing products team. These folks are geniuses in terms of creating molds, or figuring out the best way to do a deck of monster cards, things of that nature. So it's a joy to work with them every day, because that's something I have no skill in. But to see them take the text that we create and either say, I have the perfect solution for how we can make these minis, or if you tweak this one little thing about the monster, this will be perfect. Can you do that? And we that's what we're here for. So we'll make those little tweaks, often making the monster or the game better in the process without even realizing that, that was an option that we could have done or should have done. So
I had a question I was supposed to ask from one person on Discord, on the d20play Discord. Rob Froberg said, tell us about the Brothering Ram. Does that ring a bell? The
Brothering Ram. Yeah, that's okay. Yeah, that's my home group is a little different. And everyone says, oh, my group's a little different. Once per year, we go to a convention and play together. And they let's say after the convention or at the end of a day, I'll go out to the bars where the DMs are, and I'll hear another DM talking to one another, and they'll be like, you wouldn't believe the table I had. And as soon as I say that, I know that it's the table that my players were at if I'm not with them. And the Brothering Ram we're an all barbarian half orc party. So doors, we don't pick locks, but we use the Brothering Ram. These are all brothers, half orc, half brothers. So the Brothering Ram is whoever rolls low, you are the Brothering Ram. Everybody grabs the Brothering Ram. They rage to take half damage, and then you run into the door with the brother. And usually after that, the door is open. There's stairs, so we play our favorite game, push them down the stairs. So that's where the Brothering Ram came from.
John?
I'm after Brothering Ram, I'm not sure where to go.
Well, in that vein, can you tell us about the door that you created that's notorious for killing characters unjustly, stories hold?
Okay, so this is a longer story. I will keep it as short as I possibly can. I wrote an adventure in which there was a trap on a door, and it was meant to be very deadly. The problem was I put in scaling, right? It was for an adventure for 5 to 10 characters level 5 to 10. I put in a scale for if they're 5th level, it does this much damage. If they're 10th, it does this much. And unfortunately, that got cut out of the final adventure. So it just did standard damage. So a bunch of 5th level characters played it, they took the full brunt of the damage from the trap on the door, and some of them died. I would have never even known this, except Mike Shea, also known as Sly Flourish, was one of the players that this happened to. And I met up with a bunch of folks after a day at Gen Con, and Mike was complaining about this horrible adventure. And I realized within 30 seconds, because I walked in halfway through this conversation, 30 seconds later, I realized it was the adventure I wrote. So I listened for a while and I said, well, why'd you take so much damage? He goes, well, that's what the trap did. And we were at a restaurant where I was trapped in the corner of this long table with like 30 people on each side, and I was against the wall. So I had to sit there, and Mike was just letting me have it about this adventure and how awful it is to put that. And I had a big piece of carrot cake because I had already had dinner. So I had a big, and I'm just sitting there mournfully eating this carrot cake while Sly Flourish is just letting me have it from this side. So love Mike, but that was a pretty brutal evening.
I'm looking at the
Yeah,
Ghostfire
and
Gaming
also-
site. Oh, go ahead, John.
Yeah. I was going to also always remember to tier your traps if you're writing an adventure that covers a range.
Yeah.
They always tier the monsters, but sometimes you forget to tier the traps.
So, having been involved in the Adventure League stuff and the other iterations of organized play for so long, are there insights that you have about the sort of future of those sorts of campaigns, those sorts of convention-based things that you have a sort of insider view on that we might not have from the trenches where we are?
Yeah. Well, I think.
What do you see as
I
the
think-
future?
Yeah, I can talk about the past because the past doesn't necessarily repeat itself, but it often rhymes. So DMs or D&D role-playing games run on the backs of game masters, of DMs. Without DMs, there is no games. So you need to be able to support game masters. And one of the best ways to do that, in my experience, has been organized play campaigns, organized play systems, especially those that bring people together at conventions in person or even online. Because I started D&D back in 1979. I started DMing probably about 1983. I ran games for years in first edition and second edition. Started in third edition, ran a few games, and then joined the RPGA. When I got to my first convention as a player, I realized what a horrible DM I was. I thought I was great. My players always told me I was good. But I realized all the ways I was lacking because I was seeing 5, 6, 7 other DMs running at a convention. And then I started DMing at conventions, picking up tips from the DMs that I had seen and experiencing everything for the first time with strangers at the table. Then I realized there are different kinds of players, different archetypes of players. And there are different strategies you can use to deal with those types of players, or better yet, deal with different types of players at the same table. And that sort of thing it's great when organized play campaigns give you content. Wonderful, great. You can get stories, you can share stories with each other. But that sort of experience that you get as a player and as a game master by encountering different aspects of the game is invaluable. I wouldn't be here today if I didn't have that experience back in 2001. So I think it's really important for that sense of community and that sense of support that you get from each other, realizing sometimes role-playing games, less so now, but definitely in the past, could make you feel like an outsider, could make you feel like you're different from everybody else as you're walking through the grocery store, as you're walking up the street and you see everybody else doing these other things. And you're like, they're not like me. I enjoy thinking about orcs and elves. But then you get to these conventions, you realize, yes, there are hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people who think about orcs and elves and like to do these things. And it builds this community and it makes the game stronger. And so to get to lose support of that, especially from the company that's benefiting most from it,
Mhm.
is it's hard to watch, and these lessons get repeated year after
Right.
year, edition after edition, where companies, not just Wizards of the Coast, but companies that own games say, we don't need that, or we would like to have something like that, but we're not going to invest any money into it. And it pays for itself over time if you just let it happen and help mold it in the direction that you need it to go.
Right.
I hope I
Right.
answered the question, because I
I think
get
that's
really
great. No,
up about this. Yeah.
I'm glad I hit that vein. No,
Mhm.
I think it's absolutely true that um, it's I think it's very hard for people who aren't gamers to come into the space of running this part of the business and understand that how collaborative it is. That the company is really dependent upon the game masters and the dungeon masters who are bringing so much of their own creativity just to the table. Um, and it's if you what you're used to is designing a product that people just buy and use without having to bring a lot of their own creativity to it. It's you know it's not even there isn't even like an equivalent in I was playing with metaphors because past lives as writers, but it's not even equivalent to like cooking or like something like HelloFresh or things like that. HelloFresh gives you a box of ingredients and tells you what to do with them. But if HelloFresh didn't come with instructions, that would be what dungeon mastering would be, except that every time you get a box of HelloFresh, you also have to serve a dinner party with it, with no instructions. There you go.
Right.
It's a
Yeah,
terrible,
no,
terrible
that,
metaphor, and we should edit this out. This is terrible, Tom.
no, I think we can build upon this terrible metaphor. Let's give it a shot. No, you're absolutely right.
And you're
Right.
drunk.
Role playing games are their own special animal in terms of what they are and how they're used. Right. When you create a role playing game, you're not creating a story. You're not creating. You're creating a machine. And not only are you creating a machine, but you're creating a machine that somebody else out there is going to have to understand and be able to put their own pieces in order to get the outcome they want.
Right.
And so not only are you writing a how-to manual, but you're writing a how-to manual to people who are going to use this hammer as a chisel and as a light bulb fixer and as whatever. And you have to anticipate it. You have to be very specific in telling them how it's meant to be used and how they can go off brand with it and still make it work. So it's a challenge like no other. I've written user manuals in the past, and they're hard to write, but they're easy compared to role-playing games, because for all the reasons I just said.
David, any more questions before we go on to starter adventures?
I think that's a great note to go on to starter adventures.
Okay, let's start with the starter adventures that Shawn worked on, or a bunch of them that Shawn worked on. In the Adventures League for 5th edition, this was, what year was this? 2014. There we go.
14, yeah.
Yeah, 2014, Defiance and Flan. And you did the first adventure for seasons 1 through 5 and season 10 for sure.
10, yeah.
And they all have this pretty interesting format where they're broken down into small mini adventures. Was that your idea? Who came up with the idea for the mini adventures broken apart like that?
I'm not exactly sure. I worked with Chris Tulloch, who was and now is again the head of the Adventurers League. I worked with the administrators. I think it was Travis Woodall who was in charge of this at the time. And so we I think Chris and Travis got together and said, how do we want to do this? Then you bring in Dave Christ from Bald Man Games, who would be the person that would oversee the running of this first adventure at Gen Con. And then they decided this format would work. And then they came to me and said, could you do this? And of course I said yes, without knowing anything about what I would be able to do or not, because when you're a freelancer, you just say yes and then you figure it out as you go. But the format's interesting because it's 5.
Yeah, this one
Yeah,
was
it's
5, but it
5.
changed.
This one
Sometimes
was
it was
5,
only 4.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah, 5 1-hour mini adventures that come together to form a full adventure that then lead into the story or the theme of that season of Adventurers League. With this one was particularly tricky for a few reasons. One, the full rules weren't out yet when I started writing it. It was still D&D Beyond at that point. 2, it needed to be run at Gen Con, and each adventure needed to last exactly 1 hour. Not 1 hour and 5 minutes, not 45 minutes, but between hopefully 55 minutes and 1 hour, because they were selling tickets for each part. So as soon as you get behind once, then the line starts to drag. And so when I was playtesting this, which I did many times each episode, I had a stopwatch, and I would DM. I'd try it with 4 players. Oh, let's try it with 6 players. And I was tweaking the whole time to try to get it to that exact point where between about 50 or 55 minutes and an hour, the players could play that mini adventure. The DM could say, great, here's a cert, a little piece of paper that says you played it, or in your log sheet, fill out that you played this, give them that time, get butts out of seats, out the door, and then the next people in line are in and setting and ready to go. So just trying to do that was mind-boggling. But then you add, all right, each mini adventure has to be an adventure. It has to have a beginning, a middle, and end, a story to it, but it all has to fit in this overall schema of what the season is going to be, which was Tyranny of Dragons for this first adventure. And so I sat down with that blank sheet of paper to write this, and I was just, what do I do? Because there was no template to go from. There was no, just figure, go from these other 12 adventures in the series. And no, this was, let's go. So what I did, probably stupidly, but it worked out in the long run, was give each adventure a very specific theme. That theme would then have to limit me, not just in terms of the format, which was already limiting, but in terms of the content that I would have to put in. So since it was a dragon themed Tyranny of Dragons adventure, I said, okay, there's 5 mini adventures. There are 5 chromatic dragons. Let's make each one associated with one chromatic dragon, although we couldn't put dragons in because these are first level characters. So, and then I'm like, okay, so let's start with red. We'll start with a red dragon. Okay, so let's use red as a theme. So every time I stopped, I said, okay, this is a red dragon themed adventure. Let's put something with fire in. Let's put something, and narrowed it down in that way, story wise and thematically, to help me focus my mental energy in the right direction. And it went very well. It was fun. I sort of journaled as I went to remind myself of what this experience was like. And I wrote a lot about it later in a blog I did. I think the blog is called Mastering Dungeons too. You can find it, but I wrote about writing each one, why I did what I did, what I would change if I could change it now. And it was pretty fascinating to think back on it then.
So when you did the giant season, was each theme a giant type?
Yep.
Yeah.
I used that same
And again, you couldn't use giants,
format.
so you had to use your
Right.
creativity to do the giant theme without giants.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But again, it worked out. At least in terms of being able to write it, I didn't get a horrible block because I had that theme I could always fall back to.
Were there
Any question?
game
Go ahead, Dave.
instructional takes from these where you were trying to teach people about D&D, or?
I did. I wrote them in an order that I thought would be useful to new DMs, because this came out at the Gen Con that the core rule books came out. So technically nobody had played or DM'd before this, unless they were a playtester or had early access to the books. So what I did with the first one was I made it all role playing. There, you could have a combat, but I made it all role playing. So if this was a new DM or a group of new players, you would just get the feeling for how you make ability checks. So it was very much a role play heavy. Let's get players' feet wet. And what I did, spoilers for a almost 20-year-old adventure, but in the first one, the characters had to pretend they were someone else. So if you were a new player playing a character, you could sort of fall back on, well, I know what it's like to pretend to be something. Not that I do it all the time, but I understand the concept of acting. So the characters had to act, which gave the players a way in, even if they were uncomfortable being a D&D player. They could fall back on just being a person who has pretended in the past. So their characters were pretending to be other people.
That's ingenious.
Well,
Yeah.
I thank you. I hope.
Really good.
And the second one then got into combat. The second mini adventure. It's go into the goblins' cave and figure out if they kidnap these people. Okay. And so there's a trap and some combat. And, so I worked through that. I tried to take each pillar one by one. So then one was a heavy investigation one where you had to talk to people to figure out what was common between all of them at this bar as this thing was happening. And so, yeah, I tried to do that because it was clear to me that you're going to have a lot of new DMs, or at least new DMs with 5th edition, and possibly a lot of new players. So let's do that with Defiance and Land specifically.
All right, the next one I'm going to look at here is actually from Kobold Press.
Oh boy,
the Scarlet Citadel, and this is Steve Winter was the lead writer on this one. This isn't really an intro adventure, but it has a real feel for Tomb or the Village of Hamlet and Temple of Elemental Evil. So it kind of was pretty nostalgic for me when I read through it and saw it. And then they have a really nice adaptation of this on Roll20, which I use, and they probably have the same thing, I would imagine, on what is the other one? Something
Fantasy
Forge.
Grounds?
Foundry.
Okay.
Yeah. Or Foundry for sure. So yeah, they have a player landing screen. They have a screen for a DM tutorial about how to use their software. Really well done. And so the pretty neat little starting adventure there from Kobold Press. I don't know if Kobold Press has an on-purpose starting adventure. I'll do a search for that here shortly. We have
subject of crossing the streams of classic adventures. I need to call out Shawn's Against the Cult of Chaos, which was a D&D Encounters season from probably 15 years ago that mixed up Village of Hamlet and Against the Cult of the Reptile God, which is sort of a classic early beginning adventure.
Yeah.
Because of all the storytelling innovations that it had, and definitely an adventure I admired when I was running it at the game store.
Yeah, that was when they were switching from 4th to D&D Next, and so we had to try to find a way to do both. So you could run it in 4th edition. You could also run it in the first D&D Next rules. But that was a James Wyatt inspired adventure. He was the person at Wizards was handling that. So he told me that his home campaign did this, and that he wanted to see it done as an encounter season if we could. So we did that, and it was a lot of fun.
Okay.
Well, Tom,
next, go ahead, Dave.
If we have a moment, I'd kind of like to talk about. I have 5 rules for a beginning adventure rules, which is probably overstating it a bit, but I'd love to run through my list and kind of get reactions or
Yeah, please do.
or the
Go ahead.
sort.
Go ahead, David.
So
writing these
my
down.
idea, I haven't written a lot of starting adventures, but I've certainly run a lot of new players through starting adventures because I did do the encounters program with a shifting cast of gamers coming into dropping in for their first D&D experience, or even more often their first D&D experience since 1982. And I got to read on a lot of folks who were playing D&D for the first time or for the first time in 30 years and how they'd react. And I've had similar experience at conventions. So one of my goals that I like to see in an adventure that's introducing the game to people is to try and give them a sense of each part of the game. And I think that's what Shawn was kind of alluding to with his five-headed Tiamat adventures, because each segment gives a different sense of the game. So that means to start off is with a place to explore. That's a pillar of the game, and people are going to be disappointed unless they go into a hole in the ground and explore a little bit for treasure. Second, I like to see weak foes in multiples to fight. I want to give everyone a chance to get a kill shot on a monster. And I want to avoid killing characters because that's a huge bummer. We've all seen that with adventures like, what was it? Keep on the Shadowfell that notoriously had a very deadly encounter early on. And just about any old school adventure could easily slay everyone. For the role-playing part of the adventure, I like to have a reluctant ally to win over. I want to see somebody who's maybe a little hostile or indifferent to the party, and then give them a chance to win them over as an ally to their side. I think people tend to react better to role-playing when it's goal-oriented. When you just send people into a tavern and say, "Oh, well, let's just mix and mingle." Most new players and a lot of experienced players like me are just dumbfounded. They don't know what to do next. I like to see something to figure out. So even if that's like polish up the shrine to the god that has fallen in disrepair and get a blessing, it can be super simple. But if they figure something out and solve that little tiny puzzle and get a little further along, I think that's always a big upbeat moment for people. And finally, my fifth goal is to include something magical and fantastic. We've all seen way too many adventures with, the rats in the basement. And one of the things that I've admired from like the Dungeon Crawl Classic adventures is that even if they're a starting adventure, they include all sorts of giant magical Pulp Fiction stuff that really gives people a taste for the a game that reaches beyond the rats in the basement. So, instead of rats in the basement, I want a portal to hell in the basement that the players got to figure out how to close or something like that. So that's my kind of rules, and I'd love to hear if you've got rules to add or different takes on those sorts of ideas.
I think 2 is a great one, having weak foes and multiples to fight. I forget what adventure it was, but I remember I was getting ready to run it. I'm like, okay, so they're going to fight this one thing, and it'll die on the third person's initiative count. And the other 2 don't even really need to be there. They could have just gone to the restroom. So I'm going to give it enough hit points that lasts at least a round. I like your idea of having lots of things out there for them to knock down.
And it's hard to pull off because D&D doesn't have a lot of really fragile low-level monsters, paradoxically. Mm-hmm. I love twig blights. I've talked about that before. I also like foes in those early adventures that don't have parents, because I've played with enough kids and other folks who will overcomplicate that combat encounter. Now listen, I love folks who go against problems with creative solutions and like to make friends with stuff. That's wonderful. But at some point, somebody at the table is going to be disappointed if they don't get a bash something. So I like to at least include one uncomplicated foe that no one's going to feel bad about killing. You know, that makes twig blights kind of good because they're just wicked plants, skeletons, constructs, stuff like that. All good foes for beginning adventures that are uncomplicated.
Yeah.
I like
skeletons and zombies too, as
Yeah.
long as they're low enough level. Yeah.
Right.
I liked your second presentation of the role-playing point. Just the idea that role-playing with really concrete goals rather than something as prescriptive as somebody to convince or somebody to win over. I mean, there are a lot of different ways to approach that, but people who are role-playing for the first time really do need to at least have a very concrete goal. I think that's really critical.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, those are great.
And you can't make these problems that get solved. You can never make them too simple.
Yes.
You know, sometimes people say, I'm going to make a puzzle. And no matter how simple you think the puzzle is, unless you always get the table that they're just not on that wavelength, even if they're great puzzle solvers, if they're not.
Right.
So, you know, make those.
It's always way easier because you know the answer. Mm-hmm. And so you really underestimate how difficult something is unless you're really and a mystery always have 3 different ways to find your way to the solution, at least, because if you've got one single path, no one will find it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And yeah, I love that fourth one, figure something out. Make sure as a designer or as a game master, you don't fall into the trap of read my mind. Which is, there's only one answer to this, and I know what it is. And no matter what the game masters say, no matter what the players say, I'm going to say no unless they read my mind. Right? Would that fix the tarnished idol? Say yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Even if it's yes, that's part of the solution. Mm-hmm. What other thing can you do? Then, you know, you're moving forward. You're giving everyone the opportunity to think outside of the square piece of paper that's on the rectangular piece of paper that's in front of them, and realize that this game is more than just their stats. It's going on in their heads as well.
Okay, the next one we got is from Paizo, and I have never played the Paizo starter set. Right now it's on sale due to a certain OGL thing that's happening in the world right now. And their starter set is really pretty beefy. And it's got a little bit higher price point than you'll see in the Target starter sets from Wizards, but it includes a lot more, I think, as far as instruction for the players and the DM. So here's kind of a look at all the stuff that's in the starter set. And here's a look at the character sheet for the fighter that's in the starter set. And I mean, they don't take. Go ahead, John.
You're not sharing your screen at the
sorry.
moment.
Let me show that. There we go. Okay, thanks, John. So here's the fighter, and they don't take anything for granted. Let me go back and just show what's in the starter set. Show the screen here. So they got these dice that are colored different colors. Even they got pawns, so you don't need miniatures. You can use the pawns. They got starter characters. They got reference cards. They got a map, a really highly detailed map, which has a lot of stuff you talked about just now, David, about finding interesting, cool things. And then if we look at the fighter character sheet, so those colored dice that you saw, they talk about the colored dice right here. So, you know, that seems obvious to a player like us who've played for a while, but when I was showing my wife how to play and I said, hey, pick up the D20, she's like, okay, which one's that again?
Yeah,
it's not obvious to a new player what these dice are. And so, you know, right from their bedrock, they're starting with covering that. And then every part of the character sheet they describe. And they have the description there for the fighter. And then They have a book for the players. And again, in the player book, they go over all the details there. There's actually a solo adventure that reminds me of what Palace of the Silver Princess, where you go and it's kind of a choose your own adventure for the first part of the adventure. So you get a feel for what is it like to be in a game. What is it? Ask question or DM describe. You describe what you're doing, and then it gets resolved, type of thing. And then there's a game master book that's included. And the game master book, if I go to the top here, it's got the maps for the adventure. It tells you what experience points are or how you get them. I like how small the stat blocks can be. They can be plenty large too. I mean, a D&D stat block could be that small too. And then they talk about combat guides. So this beginner box from Paizo is really, really for beginners. I mean, it really goes over how to play the game, not just here's an adventure that's pretty simple that you can run for a new group of players, but it's assuming even the DM doesn't know how to play the game. So I like that. And then the last one I wanted to share is from Old School Essentials. So there's, of course, the old school, go back to first edition D&D or AD&D group that like those type of adventures. And this adventure isn't in the vein of telling you necessarily all how to do everything, but I really like their format. I like how they write on their maps what's going on in every room. And then their rooms are very technical in the way they present them. It's almost like if you're a pilot, it's almost like the pilot's checklist where you can just glance at it and find what you need to know for the room and for what's around the room. So they do a great job on that. I just wanted to share that one. But I think the winner is really the Paizo one. There's been 3 of them for D&D. So there was the first starter set, which was Lost Mine of Phandelver. Then there was the middle one, which was Dragons of Icespire Peak. And the latest one, which was Dragons of Stormwreck Isle, I think. And the very latest one, they've done more work on trying to explain to the DM a little bit in the adventure what to do. Like in the first encounter, they talk about how to run an encounter. So they're getting a little bit better, but they're a really low price point. They shoot for, $20 at Target. Here's some dice and go play.
One thing that the last box set did, which was good, was link to videos that they host at the Wizards website, which actually explains it. So if you're not a visual reading learner, you can go there and you can get it explained to you through your ears, not through your eyes, how to use it. So that was a good step forward. I'm glad they did that.
Yeah.
Tom, I stuck a link in the chat.
I will bring it up
to a Kickstarter for an OGL 5th edition sort of light starter set called Critical Core, which was it's an interesting starting place because it's actually designed for people who have never really DM'd before, to run games for new players who are typically, it's really aimed at trying to help you teach the game to people who have social skills to learn and stuff like that. So young teenagers, maybe teenagers on the spectrum, that sort of thing. And it comes with a whole lot of, a whole layer of guidance and support and structure for working with that particular population. But just in general, just thinking about how to, it gives you very specific help on how to manage a table, how to, make sure you're touching base with somebody whose attention is waning because they haven't had something to do in the past couple of minutes and stuff like that. How to do it in positive ways rather than negative ways so that you're not creating more tension and stuff like that. It's a really, really cool idea. And I think if you're in a place where you're looking at a starter set for a very specific population, and especially if you're really not sure about the table management parts of things, there's a lot of interesting stuff there.
Wow.
That's a really good find, John. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Any last thing to go over, David?
No, I think that's a good overview.
All right. Shawn, thanks for being with us. Anything you want to, any last shout outs or URLs or websites you want to share?
No, you can go to ghostfiregaming.com to see what myself and the rest of our team has been working on. Mastering Dungeons is the podcast you can find me. I'm on Twitter at Shawn Merwin, on Mastodon at Shawn Merwin tabletop at tabletop.social. And
All
I
right.
love to hear from everybody about gaming. So thank you for having me on as well.
Thank you very much, and we'll see you all later.
All right.